Mark, thank you, and great to be with you and Sydney Club and all our good friends online. Thank you. And can I first congratulate Sydney Club for taking the initiative, which has resulted in Tim Buckley and other speakers coming to speak with you, but taking the initiative to establish your climate action group back 2 or 3 years ago. I think Karen Lobley was significantly involved, and I think it's just developed really well since then. You really do get great speakers, and the timing is fantastic because Rotary's made the environment and climate a key area of focus, and you've been very much a part of that. So look, speaking on behalf of Thelma Rahman, because she wasn't in quite as good a position to make the introduction today, I have great pleasure in introducing Tim Buckley, who I've already met on a couple of occasions. Tim has 30 years financial markets experience, including providing public interest related financial analysis in the coal and electricity sector since 2013. From the late 20th century, 1998, Tim was managing director at Citicorp, worked at Macquarie Group, and then Deutsche Bank in Singapore. And he's published over 100 reports on the global energy transition. So Tim knows his stuff. He was co-founder of a startup global listed clean energy equities fund with Westpac, and has more recently worked with the global think tank IEEFA over 2013 to 2021. He founded a new organisation, Climate Energy Finance Australia, this year in 2022. He's a regular speaker to media on energy efficiency, stranded assets, an array of subjects like that, and never fails to be provocative. So I look forward to, Tim, hearing your presentation. Over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Jeremy. Great to see you again, at least online. And Mark, Thelma, Adri, thank you for organising today's event and that very kind welcome. So as Jeremy just said, my name's Tim. I would like to thank you for joining me today. I would like to start with a presentation. I'm going to risk using a PowerPoint for say 10 or 15 minutes, and then hopefully we open up for comments and question and answers. So a more free-flowing discussion, but I thought I would use a few prompts in my PowerPoint presentation to explain the some of the points that I'm making and show that it's not just my view, that there is in fact really substantial global evidence of opportunity. So firstly, as Mark said, I would like to start by also acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and could I pay my respects as well to their elders, past, present and emerging. As Jeremy said, my background is finance. I've spent the last 30 years working in finance, and more recently, at least more than a decade now, looking at the energy transition. I will start by saying I absolutely accept the climate science. I accept what our scientists are telling us. I accept the inevitable need to transition, and we can either have it as an orderly planned transition, or it will be a disorderly, unplanned transition, but it's going to happen. We have to transition our global economy. Australia has to transition, and we can embrace the opportunity or have it thrust upon us or lose it, but it's going to happen. So I accept the science. I think the events, the last 2 to 3, 1 in 500 year supposedly floods in just the last couple of years gives proof of the human impact on climate change and the need for change. But I'm going to put that topic aside. To me, largely that's a given in my world. I accept what the science is telling me, just like I accept what my doctor tells me, and I'm looking at what are the implications from a finance perspective, and more importantly, what are the opportunities, because I do believe this is going to be a huge, huge opportunity for Australia. And I think the biggest problem we've got is that our, use the word carefully, leaders, our political leaders talk about the cost of transition and the cost of acting, it's the cost of inaction that is, to me, obvious, and the opportunity is being squandered by not embracing the huge opportunities that are available for Australia. So I'm just going to spend 10 or 15 minutes talking about those opportunities to say, look, this is an economic myth, as Thelma sort of put as the topic, saying, what was the economic myth that there is too much cost and too much risk for Australia. There is too much opportunity to be wasted if we don't embrace the massive, massive opportunities for Australia. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully that'll work. Jeremy, if you can let me know when it's up properly.
You're on.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Adri. Right, so there we go. So I'm just going to go through a couple of topics. Firstly, the massive deflation, the ongoing deflation in renewables, which is where economics comes into it, where finance comes into it. There's an absolute inevitability because of the rampant deflation. So deflation means lower prices in nominal terms every year due to technology development and economies of scale. I'm going to talk about the global policy framework. I mean, it's a little hard coming in Australia where we still debate whether the climate science is even real at our political level federally. That's just garbage in my view. The science is real. The global policy action is building massively. And my background is finance. What's really amazing is to watch global financial institutions pledging to accept the science, to act on the science, and then invest. And so I'll come back to each of those points. I'll deep dive a little bit into coal, not because I think coal is important, but it is important in the Australian context. It's a big industry. It has historically been a big earner for Australia. It's been a relatively important employer. So we need to acknowledge that, and I'll just give you a few details about the inevitable structural decline of coal. The growth of emissions pricing is the economic signal that's driving part of the technology innovation. But then I'll just finish on some positive points about the massive, massive opportunity for Australia, not just in renewable energy, but also in mining. And so I think we really need to talk about the massive, massive investment, employment, and export opportunities that are Australia's to grab. We will be a renewable energy superpower, notwithstanding our federal government. So I'll finish on those couple of points. So jumping right in. Firstly, just deflation. Just if you're not aware of it, the price of solar has dropped by 90% in a decade. The price of wind's dropped by more than 50% in a decade. The price of batteries has dropped 85% in just 5 years. And that deflation is ongoing. It's really, really hard to compete with renewable energy when it has literally 5 or 10% annual price reductions, likely over the next decade, as we've seen in the last decade. So to me, there's an economic inevitability here. It's this chart a decade ago that got me excited. It's a decade ago, it was aspirational. Today, it's a reality, and it's only going to get better over time. So let's embrace the massive opportunities of deflation. And that comes at a time when we now actually in 2022 have rampant fossil fuel energy inflation. Anyone who's filled their car up and doesn't have the luxury of driving an electric vehicle knows the price of petrol has just doubled, and the price of gas, LNG, liquid natural gas in Asia has gone up tenfold. The price of coal has gone up 5 to 10-fold in the last 2 years. So there's rampant inflation in fossil fuels and there's rampant deflation in renewables. So that's a key economic driver that the finance market's getting to grips with. The second imperative as to why I'm so bullish about the global landscape, Jeremy, you've heard me say this before, but for this audience, it's the fact that we've seen China, Korea, Japan commit to massive accelerated ambition, net zero emissions by mid-century, but more importantly, action this decade. So whether it's 46% emissions reduction in Japan by 2030, 40% reduction in South Korea by 2030, whether it's peak emissions before 2030 for China, Don't be fooled by the comment, it doesn't matter what Australia does, China drives the world. Well, yes, it does drive the world, and that's really bullish in my view, because China is the world leader in wind, solar, electric vehicles, batteries, rare earths, and so on. They are absolutely embracing the economic opportunities, the investment opportunities, the employment opportunities, the export opportunities to be the world leader in all these technologies. So don't underestimate it. We're asleep at the wheel while China's leading the world transformation of energy markets. Third aspect, so I've talked about technology and deflation. I've talked about the policy framework. The third one, which gets me really excited, is the financial response. And we saw a massive shift last year where $130 trillion of capital, I'll say it again, $130 trillion, not billion, trillion dollars of capital pledged to align their investment strategies, their banking strategies, their insurance strategies with a 1.5 degree world. And so all of a sudden, the risk of stranded assets is very real. The capital flight from fossil fuels is real. In fact, part of the massive inflation we've seen in the last 18 months in fossil fuel prices is because of the capital flight, and the industry, we haven't yet invested enough in the solutions. And so we've been caught short, but I'll come back to that point. At the end of the day, global finance is moving aggressively. Thank God for Mark Carney, the ex-governor of Bank of England, for drilling the global financial system for the last 7 years about the inevitability of this huge tectonic shift in global capital, to steal a phrase from Larry Fink, the founder and the CEO and chair of BlackRock, the biggest company, the biggest investor in the world. And he talks every week about the tectonic shift in global capital. So we've got technology change, we've got policy change, and we've got finance change. You might not know it listening to the Australian politicians, but it's inevitable, it's global, and it's happening. So this is a really bizarre chart. So I'm going to pivot a deep dive for 2 minutes on coal. Now, I'm going to throw out a comment, and you might feel it confronting. That's, as Jeremy said, that's my objective, to confront you and to challenge your incumbent thinking, to challenge the myths that the Murdoch media constantly bamboozled us with. But the New South Wales Treasury last year forecast that the last New South Wales coal worker could disappear within 20 years. So this is not my forecast, this is New South Wales Treasury forecast. The green line is employment in New South Wales if we're to have a livable planet for coal industry. And the New South Wales government, really, I take my hat off to them. They've really changed from being a global laggard to a global, acknowledging the science, acknowledging the inevitability, and investing in the future and enabling the policy framework to allow New South Wales to invest in the future. And it really comes down to it. They're acknowledging every last coal job could well disappear within 20 years. Not my forecast, New South Wales Treasury's forecast. Now, just to pivot to America, a decade ago, the American government was really bullish about the outlook for coal. Now, why do I pivot to America? America was the second largest coal producer and consumer in the world 12 years ago. And you can see on the right, the EIA, so the Energy Information Administration, the Department of Energy of America, the American government forecast was that the coal industry was going to grow, or at least plateau, and it didn't. Fast forward a decade, and volume of coal mining, volume of coal consumption in America is halved. So we're not talking about a 30-year transition. We're talking about the industry, the second biggest coal producing and consuming nation in the world, halving in just 1 decade. It happened without a plan. There was no transition. There was no government plan. It just happened. And the chart on the left is the forecast coal plant closures over the coming decade, and you'll see that it actually accelerates. So there is no mandate that every coal plant must close in America, and yet it's happening because the economic policy and financial landscape has shifted so dramatically that the decline, the terminal decline of the US coal industry is now inevitable, as it is for Australia. Now, don't take my word for it. let's talk about Ian McFarlane. Now, Ian and I have done plenty of sparring in the last 5 years. You might remember Ian was the Chief Minister for Australia for Resources and Energy for a decade. He's been a coal booster, a coal lobbyist for much of his career. And this was a massive mea culpa, so good on him. I'm calling him out. This is leadership. This is acknowledging that he was wrong and acknowledging the inevitability of change is upon us and that we have to embrace it. So good on Ian McFarlane. He's still employed as the chief of a major coal lobbyist, but he came out only a month ago and called that the coal sector for the power sector in Australia could well be gone within a decade. And that's what we need. We need the industry to acknowledge the inevitability of it so that we can then plan sensibly for what do we do about it now that we've accepted the science, we've accepted the inevitability, we now can plan for the future that's going to be on us and the opportunities. And again, don't take my word for it. This time it's the IEA, not the EIA. So the International Energy Agency forecast that let's assume we have a livable planet. Let's assume we have an economy, right? And that we all still have a livable planet within 20 or 30 years. The IEA forecasts in that scenario that we have a livable planet, we still have an economy that works, then the use of coal globally is going to drop by 78% in the next 28 years. And interestingly, remember Australia is the second largest exporter of thermal coal in the world, but we're the #1 exporter of coking coal for steel. And the IEA is saying that this use of coking coal in the global steel industry is going to drop 57% in the next 28 years if we're to have a livable planet. That's the IEA. That's not my forecast. So the IEA is saying the industry is going to go into terminal decline and technology change, capital flows and policy will drive that. Now, a fourth factor is pricing. We had a carbon price in Australia for 2 years. Australia was a world leader with the carbon price. We decided that action and accepting the climate science was not in Australia's interest. How stupid was that? But anyway, that's history. Europe has embraced the need for a price signal. So the EU, European Union emissions trading pricing in the last 5 years has gone up 5 or 10-fold and hit a record high at the start of this year of 96 euros a tonne. It's sitting now down around 78 euros, but it's still up 5 or 10-fold. So industry, energy producers and finance in Europe now accepts the inevitability. They've got the price signal. They know carbon emissions have to be priced in, and there's nothing like having a price signal to drive the right financial signals, to drive the financial markets and the free economy to respond accordingly. Now, that's Europe. This is America's Californian pricing, and we saw Californian pricing double only last month. So again, going back to the EIA, so this is the American government's forecast. Californian pricing, it's still way below Europe, but it's really starting. Now, at the end of the day, I'm from finance. I believe free markets are the most powerful way of dealing with the problem, but financial markets and free markets can only work with a price signal. Price in the externality and then get out of the way and let the market solve the problem. So the price signal is there in California, it's there in Europe, it's now there in China. And so our major trading partners are getting a price signal, and they're saying if Australia wants to still be a laggard, they will inflict the carbon border adjustment mechanism on us, and they will get the revenue. They will tax Australia's high emissions exports, and they'll get the revenue, and we will suffer the consequences anyway. So they're going to inflict it on Australia if we don't actually embrace it. But I don't think it's about inflicting a cost on Australia. It's about forcing us to embrace the massive, massive opportunities that are Australia's to grab. Now, again, I come from the financial markets. This chart, I've been using this chart for a decade now, and it's still relevant. What it is the single biggest investor in renewable energy in the world. It's called Next Era Energy. Hopefully you've all heard of it, but they are the most successful utility in America. They're the largest utility in America. They've gained massive market share in the last 2 decades, and they have delivered massive, massive wealth accumulation for their investors. They're up 468% in a decade. Now, The purple, that's the green line. The purple line is the US stock market. It's been pretty robust. Over a decade, it's up 220%. The red line is ExxonMobil, the biggest climate science denier in the world, the biggest funder of climate science bullshit. I'll use that word. I know, apologies for the language, but at the end of the day, they are pushing lies onto the world, and they're undermining the science, they are undermining our livable planet, and worse, they're destroying shareholder wealth in the process. So over a decade, their shares are up 1%. Now, I put in the note, they're up 52% in a year, but even with a big recovery on the back of rampant oil and gas prices, thanks to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, they have still destroyed massive shareholder wealth. So don't take my word for it. Look at what the financial market's doing. Exxon, the biggest wealth destroyer in the energy space in the world. They are the biggest fossil fuel company in the private company in the world. They've destroyed shareholder wealth for a decade now. NextEra Energy, the biggest American utility, the biggest investor in renewables in the world, and they keep adding value. So the financial markets are really cottoned on to the fact that doing the right thing, having a livable planet, having a sustainable economic growth model is actually a wealth creating opportunity. We all know the cost of floods, but this headline from the AFR, from the Australian Financial Review last week, there is a looming market failure. We have so much distortion in our market that a lot of areas, a lot of property owners in Australia won't be able to actually even get insurance for their properties. So the idea that the cost of action is too high, that Barnaby Joyce parrots all the time, meaningless slogans that are absolutely fact-free. Okay, that's a political statement, but at the end of the day, he's standing in the way of action. And what KPMG is saying is that the cost of inaction is extreme, it's rising, and it's going to impact all of Australia. I think we all know it, but there's the headline. The Fin Review's finally cottoned on to the point that the cost of inaction is way too high. And if we keep distorting the market signal the way the federal government is doing, we damage our economy. On the positive, or actually, sorry, just to reinforce, why has climate science denialism taken such a stronghold in our federal government? And it is that Australia is the ultimate drug pusher. Okay, again, Jeremy said, I'm here to challenge you. Australia is right up there with Saudi Arabia and Russia. We're one of the 3 biggest robber barons in the world. We're the drug pushers pushing fossil fuel exports onto the rest of the world. You hear this crap about Australia is too small to count. We're only 1.3% of the world's population. We're only 1.5% of the world's emissions. It doesn't matter what we do. That is crap. We are the 3rd largest exporter of fossil fuels. We're the drug pusher of the world. We're up there with Russia. That's how bad Australia is. But getting onto the positives, lithium. Lithium prices have gone up 1,500% in the last 18 months. Now, why have I just pivoted to that? Because I'm going to finish on positives. I've given you a whole lot of negatives. Positives, lithium prices. Australia, as you can see on the right, Australia produces 49% of the world's lithium. Why are our politicians not talking about lithium every single day? They talk about coal and coal workers and coal royalties and climate destruction. Why don't they talk about the solution? Australia is the biggest producer of lithium, which makes electric vehicles and batteries in the world. We are the biggest beneficiary of the electric vehicle transformation that is happening before our very eyes. Now, the other point here is on the left. I mean, actually, the chart on the right, Australia is the world's #1 lithium producer. We're the world's #1 iron ore producer. We're the world's #1 bauxite producer. We're the world's #2 alumina producer. We're the world's #3 zinc producer. We're the world's #4 rare earth producer. We're the world's #6 nickel and the world's #5 cobalt. In other words, all of the resources that are going to drive the decarbonisation of the world, and Australia is in the top 6 in all of them. So not only is our mining industry going to help drive the global decarbonisation, but I am actually saying that we should be value adding. We shouldn't be China's quarry. we should be refining and value adding our resources before we export them. You'll be pleased to know this is my third last slide. But we should be value adding our resources using massive, massive low-cost renewable energy so that we export slightly value-added resources rather than just being a quarry to China and letting China have all of the processing, as the chart on the left shows. China's been brilliant at value-adding our resources. Why can't we value add our resources? And the answer is because we don't have a roadmap, we don't have the political will, and we have a government that's hell-bent on holding Australia back. That's a political comment. Second last slide. Here's an example of Australia. Rare earths are key to a whole lot of decarbonisation industries. Australia is a major producer of rare earths. China is the world's largest processor of rare earths. The only country that does rare earth processing outside of China is Malaysia. It's an Australian company called Lynas. Now, Iluka, another Australian company, has just proposed building the biggest refinery of rare earths in the world outside of China in Australia. And that is a huge opportunity because that's value adding our rare earths before we export them. And that's going to drive $1 billion of investment. It's going to drive value added mining, employment and exports, green exports for Australia. And Twiggy, a really divisive character, but Twiggy announced one of the most, if not the most important deal of the year in the world 2 weeks ago. And it was a deal between Fortescue Metals and E.ON, which is a huge German utility. And I'm just going to really sing the praises of this because we need leaders. And if our federal government won't provide leaders, then we need to rely on our state governments and we need to rely on corporates. And Twiggy's drunk the Kool-Aid for whatever reason. He's accepted the science and he's looked at the opportunities and realized Australia will be a world renewable energy superpower, as Ross Garnaut has been banging on about for a decade. And Ross Garnaut is absolutely spot on. Twiggy's now seen the opportunity. So this transaction that he announced with E.ON is a $30 billion a year contract to supply green ammonia to the German people, to the German government, in order to remove 1/3 of Germany's reliance on Putin's fossil gas. Okay, I put too many descriptors in there. 1/3 of Germany's gas imported from Putin, from Russia, will now be replaced with Australian green ammonia thanks to Twiggy. So I'm cheering for a billionaire. For once, he's on the right side of history. He's doing the right thing for Australia. He's helping solve the crisis. He's trying to actually solve the climate crisis and show the investment, employment, and export opportunities are enormous, and Australia will be a renewable energy superpower. So I'll stop bashing you on that. That's my pitch. I'm happy to take any comments or observations or questions.
Tim, thank you so much. There's a whole lot of questions here that have turned up in chat, so we'll go through those, and then if we've got time, perhaps you could take some from the floor, please. Sorry.
You want me to?
Yeah, can you please, because my screen just blacked. Oh, here it is. Perfect. I do apologise, the wonders of technology. So first question from Sonu was, how can we encourage climate and health literacy and awareness in the community and across the political sector?
Yeah, and 6 weeks out from a federal election, I'm going to be political. We need free press, we need Australian-owned press, and we need public interest press. So we absolutely need people like the ABC to be properly funded for their independence charter and their public interest charter to be reinforced so that we can educate our people. I think it's a deliberate strategy by the government to confuse and dumb down our people so that they actually don't understand the science, they don't accept the science, and we end up listening to the Murdoch vested interest crap that gets fed to us every day through people like the Australian newspaper. We need freedom and freedom of the press and we need Australian-owned press. And so things like The Guardian, the ABC, the Saturday paper, we need good Australian media to actually educate the people of Australia so that we stop the bullshit agenda that comes out of the Murdoch media. Effectively, I view the Murdoch media as controlling our federal government and controlling our media and therefore manipulating the people of Australia. We need education and we need to rebuild confidence in our politicians. Truth in politics, I think, would be a secondary aspect of that. We need a federal ICAC so that we can't have the corrupting influence of vested interest in our federal government. We need a whole lot of reforms to try and rebuild the democracy so that we can actually do what's in Australia's interest rather than the vested interests of the fossil fuel industry.
Thank you, Tim. You made a comment, and this is from Oscar Jones, that with the right price signals, the market will, drive. But history has shown that markets are very poor in step change innovation. The rest of the world is implementing hydrogen fuel cell trucks and buses, yet here in Australia, we have an incremental solution in exchangeable battery trucks. The CSIRO report has said that we need to invest in a network of hydrogen stations to jumpstart the industry. Surely this will not happen unless we have strong and public investment in infrastructure.
Yeah, at the end of the day, my background's 30 years in finance. Up to 20 years, I worked for the biggest financial institution in the world. I was managing director, head of research for them. At the end of the day, I believe in the power of markets, but we need a government to set the rules of engagement. We need to have a government who is elected by the people of Australia, not by Murdoch, not by Clive Palmer, someone who represents the people of Australia and can set the framework, set the policy framework, provide the market signal. At the end of the day, we've got a policy failure because we don't price in the biggest externality there is, that is carbon emissions. You price in the externality and the markets will solve themselves. So at the end of the day, is hydrogen going to be the be all and end all? I've been studying hydrogen for 5 or 6 years. I've been a big proponent for it, but it's part of the solution. It's not the solution. I think electric vehicles have already won the passenger vehicle race. But in trucking, yeah, maybe there's a role for hydrogen fuel cells. But at the end of the day, I'm all for technology innovation. I'm all for free markets, but they only work when you actually have a government actually acting in the interest of the people of Australia and setting the right framework. Now, people like Twiggy Forrest are more powerful than our government, thank God, and they're actually getting on with it. But Twiggy can't work with the Australian government, so he's actually working with the German government. He's working with the Japanese government. He's working with other governments that are acting on the science and acting on the solutions. Now, energy security is a huge, huge new driver. I mean, it's always been a driver, but Putin's invasion, and I'm saying Putin, not Russia, it was Putin's invasion of Ukraine, has really remember, there are 3 big drug pushers in the world: Saudi Arabia, Putin, and Australia. And so Putin's become a prior. Australia will follow that and will be a prior of the global economy if we keep denying the science and undermining the science and pushing our drugs. But at the end of the day, it's the German government who is trying to break the reliance on Russian gas, and they're using Twiggy Forrest, using Australia's massive opportunity. So I think hydrogen is going to play a role, but I'd much rather Australia exported green zinc or green iron or green aluminium. In other words, what is aluminium? It's congealed electricity in the form of aluminium. It's bauxite with massive, massive electricity. The opportunity to export green electricity in the aluminium is the opportunity for Australia. Green iron, I mean, we export $100 billion a year of iron ore every year. Why don't we value add it 10% before we export it? Well, there's a good idea. That's a $10 billion opportunity for Australia every year forever. Australia exports 38% of the world's iron ore. Why don't we value add it before we export it using massive renewable energy? So I think hydrogen maybe has been a bit hyped. I like the fact that it is hyping the financial markets. It's making the financial markets globally realize there's a big technology innovation coming. If anything, I mean, one of the most interesting chats I had was with Fortescue 2 weeks ago, when they did the deal with E.ON in Germany, they said, not only is that deal the biggest energy deal contract in the world, $30 billion a year, but the mind shift in the German heavy industry that came on the back of it, all of a sudden Siemens and ThyssenKrupp and Linde, 3 of the biggest power companies in Germany, are now actually helping Fortescue solve green hydrogen, green ammonia. And so they're being incentivized by the German government to invest in the solutions. And when Siemens and Linde and ThyssenKrupp get behind it, when the Germans choose to do something, they're almost as good as the Chinese at actually solving problems. And so that's great. So I really think Australia is really missing a trick here. We're missing the massive investment opportunities, the massive employment opportunities that countries like Germany and China are seizing.
Thank you. We've got a comment from Glenn, a question from Glenn saying that no doubt coal for energy production is on the way out due to renewables. However, what technologies replace it in steel production? Carbon fibre, activated carbon filters, etc. How do we put the last coal miner out of work? And is Australia ready for it?
Yeah, and Glenn, that's a really important question, but I'll rephrase the last bit, Deborah, that you just mentioned. I don't want to put the last coal miner out to work. I don't want to pay them a pension for the next 30 years. They're skilled workers. They have every right to have a job, but this is a free market. Their industry is dying. Let's make them lithium miners. Let's make them rare earth miners. Let's make them nickel miners. Let's actually redeploy them in a skill set that they're really good at, but in an industry that solves the problem. Let's stop talking about the importance of coal workers is crap. I mean, they're miners. They can transform and become the solution. And that way, those communities don't get totally, okay, maybe they need to move. Maybe they need to move to Perth or Western Australia or wherever the lithium is, the rare earth is, wherever the nickel is, the copper is, whatever. So we need to actually use those workers. So I've gone down a bit of a rabbit hole there, but you said the death of the coal industry, but it's actually they're miners. Let's talk about the mining opportunities for Australia. So I've managed to lose Glenn's question in that. Do you want to rephrase it?
Glenn, do you want to, is there anything that you'd like to ask further?
Yeah, I think it's just around the replacement technologies. I think hydrogen has been mooted as the one for to replace coal and steel production. But there's a lot of other things that we use in daily life, around activated carbon filters, etc. So are those technologies ready, and is Australia ready to benefit from them?
Thanks, Glenn. Yeah, there was probably, I mentioned the Fortescue E.ON deal is the most exciting deal we've had all year, but the second most exciting deal, I mean, it actually happened literally in the second or third week of January. And at the time I said, this will be the most exciting deal of the year for energy transition globally. So bear with me, it's a little technical. It's a Swedish innovation. It's called SSAB. So the Swedish steel company, SSAB, announced their hybrid technology. They've been investing along with the Swedish government, and along with Vattenfall, the biggest Finnish power utility, and a coking coal and iron ore company in Sweden. I can't name them all, they're all Swedish names. But those 3 companies have been working on the hybrid technology. So the CEO of SSAB announced in January of this year that because of the technology investment and development, the research, development and deployment that Hybrid's been doing for 5 years, he was now so confident in the technology commercialization roadmap that they've been working on for 5 years that he brought forward the end date by 15 years to 2030. So Glenn, to your question, what SSAB is talking about is using a completely re-engineering of the whole steel manufacturing process. If you think about it, steel manufacturing uses Australia's #1 export, iron ore, and then it uses our #2 export, coking coal. You burn the 2 at huge temperatures and you out pop steel, right, through a blast furnace. So Hybrid is all about removing the need for coking coal and replacing it with green hydrogen, which will be produced using renewable energy by Vattenfall. It will then use the hydrogen to get the high temperatures and to activate the carbon to react with the iron ore to enable steel production without any carbon emissions whatsoever. Now, that's one technology that's called hybrid. And the CEO of the biggest steel company in Sweden announced that he was bringing forward the commercialization of that technology, the entire decarbonisation of the Swedish steel industry by 15 years to 2030. That's his end date. 2030, Sweden's steel industry will produce no carbon dioxide emissions in the production of virgin steel. Now, BlueScope is Australia's biggest steel company, steel manufacturer, but BlueScope actually manufactures 2/3 of their steel in America. BlueScope last month just acquired $250 million investment in scrap recycling. Why? Because the American steel industry is 2/3 or more based on electric arc furnaces. So you normally make steel in a blast furnace. The alternative, the American alternative, is use electric arc furnaces, which means you use electricity and you can use scrap steel and recycle the steel. So you actually need no coking coal at all, and you need no iron ore at all if you're using scrap steel in an electric arc furnace, and you create almost no emissions in the process if you use renewable energy. So BlueScope, a global laggard in Australia, is actually a global leader in America. Funny that, we're a global laggard as a country. America under President Biden is trying to regain some global leadership in this, and BlueScope's investing hundreds of millions of dollars building out their scrap recycling capacity and building the biggest, newest electric arc furnace in America so that they can produce virgin steel using 100% recycled scrap and renewable energy. So whether it's hydrogen, whether it is scrap recycling, there are massive changes coming. And I've mentioned Sweden, I've mentioned America and BlueScope. I'll mention one other company. The biggest steel company in the world is ArcelorMittal. ArcelorMittal announced in February of 2022 that they were going to reduce the emissions of their entire French steel industry. So ArcelorMittal is the biggest producer of steel in France, and they said that they were going to reduce the emissions across the whole of France's steel industry for their operations by 40% within 8 years, and they announced that in February of this year. So in other words, you can do more incremental steps, you can close your blast furnaces, you build your electric arc furnaces, you build scrap recycling, you build green hydrogen. I'm not an engineer, I'm a finance person, but I look at what the biggest investors in the world and the biggest corporates in the world are doing. And sorry, you've just got an earful about steel. You probably didn't want to know it. I just find it staggering how fast the global steel industry is moving. And to Glenn, final point on Glenn's question, Australia is the world's largest exporter of iron ore. We're the largest exporter of coking coal in the world. We have a huge, huge strategic threat to our economy if we don't embrace the opportunities, because our two biggest exports are terminally challenged if we don't. So why would we not embrace the opportunity and protect those companies, protect those industries, protect the workers and the communities, and protect our economy in the process by embracing the opportunities rather than putting our head deep down in the coal mine and science denialism?
Thank you, Tim. I've got a couple of interesting questions that reference Saul Griffiths, slave traders and fossil fuel barons, but I'm going to jump to another question that I think might be of interest to our members. How can we use the money in our super funds to drive change?
Deborah, that's a really important and positive question. I was actually just talking to before this meeting, a major Australian developer of wind and solar projects. And he was saying, look, Australia's got the best wind and solar resources in the world, tick. We've got a really low population density and a massive, massive land mass, tick. We can develop renewable projects unlike any other country in the world. We've also got an established position to key trusted supplier of energy at world scale to Japan, Korea, and China and Taiwan, tick. We're established, we're credible, and we know how to do world-scale projects. But the one he missed is the one you just asked about. We also have the 4th largest capital pool in the world. I'll shout out Paul Keating. I love what Paul Keating did to the financial markets of Australia 30 years ago. He built Australia's superannuation pool along with franking, and that $3 trillion of capital now is available and ready to be deployed. And in fact, the super fund, the Australian Future Fund, just announced they've just opened a massive office in London, and they're doubling the number of staff they're employing in London because they can't deploy enough capital in our country. So our federal government's superannuation fund, the Future Fund, is going to invest in America and Europe because they can't deploy enough capital fast enough in Australia, because our super funds are growing so big. Now, turn it on its head. Ross Garnaut and Twiggy Forrest are both talking about building renewable energy zones across Australia and building the world's biggest wind, solar, battery, green hydrogen, green ammonia investments in the world. Now, Australia has 2 of the 5 largest renewable energy projects in the world. They're called the Asian Renewable Energy Hub. One's in the Pilbara, one's in Esperance, both are in Western Australia. We then have Sun Cables up in Northern Territory, the 6th largest renewable energy project proposal in the world. So we've got 3 of the 6 largest proposals in the world, each of them $50 billion of investment. That is going to enable a huge amount of renewable energy investment, and our capital position is such that we can actually fund that using our, well, if we don't fund it, then the Germans will fund it, the Americans will fund it, the Chinese will fund it. It'll come from somewhere because it is such an obvious place to invest in Australia. We've got the best wind, the best land, the best solar. We've got good capital markets. We've got the best engineers and scientists. We can do all of this, and we can be a renewable energy superpower. So why are we not embracing the opportunity? And the answer is because the renewable energy industry isn't buying our federal government the way the fossil fuel industry is. So we need absolute donation reform of our federal political system and truth in Parliament and freedom of the press, so that Australia can be unshackled to grab the huge, huge opportunities that are before us.
Thanks, Tim. I've got a question from Lewis from the Rotary Club of Cleveland, asking how you see domestic GHG emission reduction projects having the benefit to sell their carbon credits in international markets, and not only ERF, Australian Emission Reduction Fund, mostly based on carbon farming projects.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a huge opportunity for Australia. Unfortunately, Angus Taylor realised it was a huge opportunity for Australia, so he thought he'd destroy it on the way out. He's wrecking the joint. I'm definitely not an Angus Taylor fan. So Australia's emissions reduction minister, I use that advisedly. Our energy minister, I use that advisedly, because COAG wants to meet without Angus Taylor because he's too disruptive to the transition and the investment needs of Australia. But anyway, I'll stop swearing. So the emissions reduction fund, the carbon, the ACCU process, the ACCU is the acronym for the Australian ETS. It's there. It's taken a massive body blow of integrity questions. One of the key scientists who was driving the development of carbon farming in Australia came out. You might have seen he's done a massive whistleblower saying the integrity is shot, that the government, our federal government, has corrupted the process. So I think you know my views on that. But we put credible Australian government in place again. Let's hope that happens in 6 weeks' time. I'm all for the independents who bring community-led representation for Australia, and they get the fossil fuel vested interest out of our government, and then we can actually start taking advantage of the opportunities. So the question that was just asked was about the opportunity for Australia to be the world-leading supplier of soil sequestration of carbon. Absolutely #1 opportunity for Australia. Every Australian farmer should be embracing that opportunity. They can't do it without a credible scheme. They can't do it without a credible government policy framework. They can't do it without a price signal. And so instead of all this crap that Barnaby Joyce goes on of the cost of inaction's too high, the cost of action's too high, better get his bullshit slogans right. The opportunity for our farmers to drive the world decarbonisation. At the end of the day, we've pumped way too much carbon into the atmosphere as a planet, as a species, we now need to absorb some of that carbon. I'm not a scientist, but we've got too much up in the air. We've got to pull it back into the soil, into our trees. We need massive forestry replanting. We need the ACCU process to be done on steroids. We need the right price signal, and our farmers can be a core global leader in this area. And then, as the question asked, Australia should be exporting those credits. We've got low population density. We've got brilliant farming expertise. We can do soil sequestration better than anyone else if only we had the right government framework and the right price signal, and then we could export those credits and we can help solve this global climate crisis. Rather than being a parasite, rather than being a drug pusher, we could solve the problem for the world.
Tim, thank you. We've only got a minute, and maybe this will be a yes or no answer, and I'm hoping it's a yes answer. From Hilary Lloyd's, Soil Griffiths talks about financing fossil freedom. Can you please comment on how realistic this could or should be so that we can electrify everything?
Yeah, it's brilliant. Saul is brilliant. I've worked a little bit with him. He's obviously spent 20 or 30 years working in America. He's written a couple of books on electrify everything. He's absolutely passionate about it, but he's dead right. The opportunity to electrify everything is huge. And Australia, we could replace $20 billion a year of oil imports into our country. $20 billion a year of oil imports. We're relying on, we're funding the Saudi Arabians, right? One of the other three drug pushers. We're funding them rather than using electric vehicles, which would use domestic wind and solar. So the idea that we should, I mean, Saul's dead right, and I'll let him read his book. It's brilliant. He's passionate about it. We need a war footing because the scientists are telling we need a war footing to actually solve this process, but we need to electrify everything. That means electric vehicles, it means batteries, it means rooftop solar, it means ground heat pumps to replace and induction cooking to replace gas cooking in our homes. The health consequences of that would be huge for Australia, positive. We're putting methane into our houses every night. We're poisoning our children. We should be using induction cooking. We should be using ground heat pumps. We should be electric vehicles. Those electric vehicles are batteries on wheels. They provide the grid stabilization that we need. We'll have negative power prices every day of the year thanks to rampant solar. And so we'll have massive deflation. The opportunities, as Saul Griffith says, are enormous. So if you haven't looked at his speeches or read his book, have a read of it. He's an Australian. He's a professor. He's brilliant. He's evangelistic about it, but he's helping advise the Biden administration. He should be helping advise the Australian government, but our government is so captured by vested interests, they're not interested. But good news is our state government ministers are. So shout out to Matt Keane, to Lily D'Ambrosi, Mick de Brenny. Fortunately, where our federal government is captured, our state governments are showing leadership. So I'll finish on a positive note.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm going to, and thank you for answering all the questions so comprehensively. I'm going to hand over to Karen Lovelay now for a vote of thanks.
Well, Tim, I have to say I'm blown away. I guess I've heard, you know, having been a bit obsessed with climate stuff for a few years now, I've heard a lot of bad news. And it's very refreshing to have a positive note on all of this, in what's possible, in what we can all do as individuals, what we can do as Rotary clubs. It's just been fascinating. I love your straightforwardness in your comments. There's no beating around the bush with that. So thank you very, very much for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure. I don't know whether we've ever had quite so many questions and quite as much interest. So hopefully Rotary can be leading some of the way in getting things done. Thank you very, very much again. And I'll see you again in other forums. It's been our pleasure. And I think on behalf of our speakers, we donate $100 to Rotary Foundation, Or is it Give Every Child a Future? Nobody briefed me on that one. Give Every Child a Future, where we're vaccinating hundreds of thousands of young people and children in the Pacific Islands, as Rotary does do those things. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sharon.